AITA for not getting real food and causing my friend's husband to sell his stuff. I'm 20 years old, and for the past few months, I've been living with my friend and their husband. My family situation was pretty toxic, and when everything finally hit a breaking point, my friend offered me a place to stay. They've been incredibly supportive, helping me learn how to take care of myself and unlearn the constant guilt I've been carrying, this belief that everything bad that happens is somehow my fault. It's been a struggle, but I'm trying to get better at it. To give you a bit of context about the household, my friend is 24, their husband is a bit older, though I'm not entirely sure of his exact age. They've been married for a little while, and though they have their ups and downs, things have been tense lately, especially when it comes to money and food. We're not exactly well off. My friend works, I work, and their husband works, but it's not like any of us are raking in huge paychecks. We all have bills to pay, and it's a balancing act trying to keep things afloat. Recently, though, things have been getting harder, especially when it comes to groceries. Last Friday, my friend's husband started complaining about how there was no real food in the house. All we had left were some boxes of macaroni and cheese, potatoes, and a few other odds and ends. He was frustrated, saying he didn't want to keep eating the same stuff over and over. My friend, who has been trying to keep things civil, pointed out that he hasn't really been contributing to the grocery budget. He only buys food for his work lunches, and most of the other food he eats is actually stuff my friend's dad has been bringing into the house as a kind gesture. My friend reminded him that this food wasn't even meant for him, it was meant for them. His response? He said he didn't make enough money to help buy food. He earns around $400 a week, and while I understand that's not a lot, my friend and I both felt it wasn't fair for him to completely shirk responsibility for household groceries. I suggested we could go to the local food bank since they distribute food on the second Tuesday of every month. I thought it might help ease the burden a little, but he dismissed the idea, saying he didn't want to eat that kind of food. That stung a bit, because I know plenty of people who rely on food banks to get by, and there's nothing wrong with needing that kind of help. It felt like he was being prideful in a way that wasn't helping any of us. We then brought up the idea of applying for food stamps. My friend can't apply without him because they're married, and he immediately shut the idea down. I don't even know how to file for food stamps myself, and honestly, I've been too overwhelmed with everything else to figure it out. When he shot down that idea too, I just gave up on trying to reason with him. Here's where things got tricky for me. I had just gotten my paycheck, which wasn't a lot, but I was planning to use it to save for some things I really needed. Instead, I decided to spend the entire thing on stocking up the house with food because I couldn't stand the idea of everyone, including the dogs, going hungry. I spent $250 at the store, way more than I had planned, and tried to stretch every dollar as far as I could. I had to cut back on the quality of the dog food I usually buy to make the money work, which made me feel terrible because I love my dogs, and they mean everything to me. One of them is even my emotional support animal, so keeping them healthy is a top priority for me. My friend's dad was kind enough to drive me to and from the store, and by the time we got home, I felt pretty good about what I had managed to get. I stocked the fridge and pantry with as much as I could, focusing on things my friend and I could both eat. I'm mostly vegetarian because eating a lot of meat makes me sick, and my friend has some serious eating issues related to textures, so I made sure to buy safe foods that we could both eat. Meat was simply out of the question, it was way too expensive, and there was no way I could afford it while also buying enough food to last us all for a couple of weeks. When my friend's husband saw the groceries, he was furious. He started complaining immediately, saying there wasn't any real food in the house because I didn't buy any meat. I tried to explain to him that I'd looked at the prices and just couldn't make it work. I told him that if I'd bought meat, I wouldn't have been able to get enough food for everyone, and I thought it was more important to focus on quantity over catering to individual preferences. He wasn't having it. He said I was selfish and should have cut out some of the things I bought for myself to make room for meat. His words hit me hard, and even though I knew I had done my best, I couldn't help but feel like I had screwed up somehow. My friend was quick to defend me, telling their husband he needed to be more grateful. They reminded him that I had spent all my money to make sure there was food in the house and that he hadn't contributed anything. But he kept sulking. He ended up selling 2 of his gaming consoles to buy himself more food, and while I understand it must have been hard for him, the way he handled it just made everything worse. He kept complaining about how little he could afford with the money he got from selling the consoles and how unfair it was that he only had one left. He acted like I was the reason he had to sell them, even though he hadn't lifted a finger to help with groceries in the first place. Now I feel like I'm stuck in this endless loop of guilt and frustration. On one hand, I know I did the best I could with what I had. On the other hand, his attitude is making me feel like I'm the bad guy, like I should have somehow made things work differently. My friend keeps telling me that I didn't do anything wrong and that their husband is just being unreasonable, but it's hard not to internalize his complaints when he's being so vocal about them. Edit. Please stop telling me to get rid of my dogs. One of them is my emotional support animal, and I absolutely need her to function like a normal human being. She helps me manage my anxiety and paranoia, alerts me when I'm having an anxiety spike, and even keeps me grounded when I start hearing things that aren't there if I'm alone. This dog is not just a pet, she's my lifeline, and I can't even begin to imagine functioning without her. Also, adding this because someone thinks this is fake. I don't even know what a LARP is, but for the record, I am not dating my friend. I'm non-binary, and my attractions are strictly to women and other non-binary people. Men are not, and have never been, on my list of interests. For further clarification, we live in a house. It's not fancy, and it has its issues, but it works for us, and it's a safe place for me right now. As for the dogs, they weren't bought, there was an accidental litter we didn't plan for. We've been working on finding good homes for the puppies, but we want to make sure they're fixed before we give them away to ensure the cycle doesn't repeat. We're already planning to give 2 of them away as soon as they're ready. Instead of making assumptions, please ask if you have questions. This post was originally twice as long, but I had to cut it down to fit the character limit. Update 1. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone who offered support and advice. It really meant a lot to read your comments and see that there are people who understand what I'm going through and genuinely want to help. After taking a step back and going through everything people said, I realized it was time to take a more proactive approach. The way things have been going wasn't sustainable, and something had to change. My friend and I decided to sit down together and take a hard look at our finances. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. We laid everything out: income, bills, groceries, and even little things like pet supplies. What quickly became clear was that the way we'd been splitting expenses as a household wasn't working. My friend and I were shouldering most of the financial burden while her husband contributed the bare minimum, and even that was inconsistent. It wasn't just frustrating, it was unfair, especially given how hard both of us were trying to make things work. As we went deeper into the numbers, my friend opened up about something she hadn't told me before, something that completely blindsided me. She admitted that for months, she had been quietly covering some of her husband's personal debts. At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but then she explained. He had apparently taken out payday loans to buy gaming equipment and other unnecessary things, stuff he absolutely didn't need, especially given how tight money already was. My friend had been helping him pay off those loans because she didn't want to see him spiral financially. She had been quietly dealing with this all on her own, not wanting to burden me or anyone else with the stress. I was stunned. Suddenly, so many things made sense: her constant stress about money, her frustration with him that always seemed to bubble under the surface, and even why she sometimes seemed more exhausted than usual. She had been carrying this huge weight while still trying to keep the household running and support me through my situation. I felt a wave of guilt for not realizing sooner just how much she had been dealing with. At the same time, I was furious on her behalf. The idea that he could be so careless with money while we were all scraping by was beyond frustrating. When my friend confronted him about it later, it was like watching a bomb go off in slow motion. He didn't even deny it. He admitted to taking out the loans and spending the money on things like consoles, games, and other frivolous stuff. But what really shocked me was his attitude. He didn't seem remorseful or apologetic. Instead, he doubled down, saying it was her duty as his spouse to help him with his debts. He even implied that she should be grateful he was willing to sell off some of his gaming consoles to contribute to groceries. It was infuriating to hear, and I could see the hurt and anger on my friend's face. That confrontation led to the biggest fight I've ever witnessed between them. My friend, who usually tries to stay calm and composed, finally snapped. She told him, point blank, that she was done enabling him. She called him out for being selfish and immature, for prioritizing his hobbies over their shared responsibilities, and for putting unnecessary financial strain on her and the household. She told him that if he didn't start contributing fairly, she would consider separating their finances, and, if things didn't improve, even leaving him altogether. It was a powerful moment, but also incredibly tense. For the first time, I saw just how much resentment had been building up in their relationship. My friend had been bending over backward to support him, both emotionally and financially, while he took advantage of her kindness and dismissed her efforts. It was heartbreaking to watch because I know she loves him, but it was also clear that she was reaching her breaking point. Update 2. Things got worse before they got better. After the last fight, my friend had finally had enough. She had been biting her tongue for months, trying to keep the peace and avoid escalating the situation, but this time she couldn't hold back anymore. She gave her husband an ultimatum: he either needed to start contributing fairly to groceries and household expenses or move out. There was no wiggle room, no compromises left to make. It wasn't an empty threat either. This was the culmination of months, maybe even years, of frustration building up, and she had reached her breaking point. For the first time, she wasn't willing to let him guilt her into backing down. In an effort to make the decision easier for him, she even offered to help him budget his $400 a week paycheck. She laid it out plainly: with some basic financial discipline, he could easily cover his share of the expenses and still have money left over. After all, $400 isn't a fortune, but it's far from nothing, especially when you're sharing living costs with others. That kind of money could go a long way if it wasn't being frittered away on things like gaming equipment, takeout, and overpriced energy drinks. She was trying to make this as straightforward as possible, giving him every opportunity to step up and take responsibility. His reaction, however, was nothing short of infuriating. Instead of acknowledging the seriousness of the situation or considering her offer, he immediately got defensive. He accused her of ganging up on him with me, as though we were plotting against him instead of simply asking him to act like an adult. He tried to paint himself as the victim, claiming that we were making him feel attacked and unwelcome in his own home. It was a pathetic attempt to deflect blame, and it was frustrating to watch. But this time, my friend didn't waver. She held her ground and made it clear that the choice was his: either he stepped up, or he'd have to find somewhere else to go. The days that followed were some of the most tense and uncomfortable I've ever experienced. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, like a storm cloud that refused to break. He barely spoke to either of us, and when he did, it was only to make passive-aggressive comments about how he was being outnumbered and disrespected. His sense of entitlement was staggering, and his refusal to take any accountability for his actions made it even harder to be around him. My friend did her best to ignore him, refusing to engage with his pettiness, while I tried to stay out of his way entirely. But no matter how much distance I kept, it felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells whenever he was in the same room. Then, while my friend and I were both at work, he did something that crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I came home to find that my emotional support dog's crate was gone. At first, I thought maybe my friend had moved it for some reason. But as I looked around, I started noticing that other supplies for the dogs were missing too, things I had paid for out of my own pocket, like their bedding and some of their toys. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had taken them. Panic set in almost immediately. That crate wasn't just a place for my dog to sleep, it was her safe space, the one place she could retreat to when she felt overwhelmed or anxious. Without it, she was visibly distressed, pacing around the house and whining in a way that broke my heart. I felt helpless, like I had let her down by not protecting the one thing that brought her comfort. When I confronted him about it, his response was as infuriating as it was callous. He didn't even try to deny what he'd done. He shrugged and said he'd sold the crate and supplies because he needed money for real food. The audacity of it left me speechless. That crate had been expensive, and replacing it wasn't something I could easily afford. But more than that, his actions felt personal. It was as though he had deliberately targeted something that he knew was important to me, just to make a point or assert some kind of power over the situation. Furious doesn't even begin to describe how I felt in that moment. When my friend got home and I told her what had happened, she was beyond livid. I had never seen her so angry, and yet she didn't yell or scream. Instead, her anger was cold and deliberate, the kind that makes it clear there's no going back. She told him, in no uncertain terms, that he had 24 hours to either replace the crate and apologize or pack his things and leave. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for him to talk his way out of it. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she wasn't going to let him cross it. Of course, he tried to worm his way out of it. He claimed I was overreacting, saying the crate wasn't even necessary, and that my dog didn't need it as much as I was making it seem. He even went as far as to try and gaslight my friend, accusing her of being unreasonable for siding with me instead of supporting him. But she didn't budge. She calmly but firmly reminded him that my dog isn't just a pet but a medical necessity for me, and that his actions were selfish, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. For the first time, he realized she wasn't going to cave. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, and spent the night at a friend's house. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it was also a relief. My friend and I sat down that night and had a long, honest conversation about what had happened and how we were going to move forward. We both agreed that enough was enough. It wasn't just about the crate or the groceries or the money, it was about the pattern of behavior he had shown over and over again. He was selfish, manipulative, and unwilling to take responsibility for anything. And we were done enabling him. We decided that if he wanted to come back, he would have to prove he was willing to change. That meant contributing fairly to household expenses, respecting boundaries, and, most importantly, taking responsibility for his actions. If he couldn't do that, then he wasn't welcome in the house anymore. It wasn't an easy decision, especially for my friend, but it was the right one. Update 4. After a few tense and quiet days, my friend's husband returned to the house. I braced myself for yet another confrontation, expecting more excuses, deflections, or perhaps even a last-ditch effort to manipulate his way back into the household without taking responsibility. But to my surprise, this time was different. He didn't come back angry or defensive, he came back humbled. His demeanor was completely unlike anything I'd seen before. It was almost disarming. He admitted that while he'd been staying with a friend, that friend had been incredibly blunt with him about his behavior. Apparently, this friend didn't sugarcoat anything and told him outright that he was being selfish and entitled, that he was acting like a child, and that if he didn't grow up soon, he was going to lose everything, including his wife. The words had struck a chord, and it seemed like, for the first time, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions and their impact on the people around him. What shocked me even more was that he apologized to me directly. He looked me in the eye and admitted that he hadn't realized how much stress he had been putting on everyone else. He told me he felt ashamed about not being able to contribute more to the household, and instead of addressing that feeling, he had lashed out, taking his frustrations out on the people closest to him. I didn't know what to say at first. It wasn't the kind of apology I had expected from him, but it felt sincere. Still, I couldn't let my guard down completely. I told him that while I appreciated the apology, words weren't enough. Actions, I said, would speak louder. And, to my surprise, he actually followed through. For the first time since I'd been living with them, he started making an effort. He got a second part-time job, working evenings and weekends to bring in some extra income. It wasn't a huge paycheck, but it was something, and it showed that he was serious about contributing. He also began setting aside $50 a week specifically for groceries. That might not sound like much, but in our household, it made a huge difference. Suddenly, we weren't running out of food as quickly, and meal planning became easier. My friend and I started feeling like we could finally breathe again. In addition to earning more money, he took a hard look at his spending habits. He downloaded a budgeting app, and every week, he tracked where his money was going. He even started asking my friend for advice on how to cut back on unnecessary expenses. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments when old habits tried to creep back in, but for the most part, he stuck with it. The change in him was gradual but noticeable, and while I was still wary, I couldn't deny that he seemed to be trying. As for me, things started looking up in my own life as well. After weeks of researching and navigating the application process, I finally received approval for food stamps. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to worry about draining my entire paycheck just to keep the house stocked with food. With the extra help, I was able to buy groceries without cutting corners, and my friend and I started planning meals together as a household. It felt good to have some stability again, even if it was fragile. The dogs, of course, remained a huge part of my support system. My friend's dad, who has been a quiet but steady source of help throughout this whole ordeal, pitched in to help me replace the crate that had been sold. Seeing my emotional support dog finally able to settle into her safe space again was a huge weight off my shoulders. The puppies, meanwhile, were thriving. They were growing quickly, and we'd been working on socializing and training them to make sure they'd be ready for their new homes. It wasn't long before we found good families for 2 of them, which brought some bittersweet relief. While it was hard to say goodbye, I knew they were going to loving homes where they'd be cared for. Throughout all of this, my emotional support dog remained my rock. She never wavered, even in the most chaotic moments. Whether I was overwhelmed with frustration or feeling a quiet sense of despair during the darkest parts of the conflict, she was always there, her calm presence grounding me and reminding me that I could handle more than I thought I could. It's hard to put into words how much that kind of companionship means, but she has been my anchor in ways I didn't even fully realize until now. The house isn't perfect, and there are still challenges to navigate. My friend's husband has made progress, but it's clear that trust will take time to rebuild. My friend has been cautiously optimistic, and I can tell she's still keeping an eye on him to make sure the changes stick. For me, there are days when I still feel the lingering effects of everything that's happened, the stress, the anxiety, the doubt, but I'm learning to let go of the guilt I've carried for so long. I've come to realize that I've done the best I could with what I had, and that's all anyone can ask for.